The late 80s and early 90s were a golden age for alternative rock, with bands like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, and Tool exploding into the mainstream. But for every group that made it big, there were of course dozens who never quite broke through. Recently, Tool's frontman Maynard Keenan opened up about 3 such bands he thought would be massive, but they ended up fading into obscurity. Today, let's talk about these 3 bands, acts that some of you have actually asked me to cover. I even interviewed one of the members years ago who later went on to have success with another 90s era group. Let me know in the comment section if you guys want me to do similar types of videos and whether you think I should cover Tool on my channel. Maynard Keenan was recently a guest on the podcast of one of the funniest comedians around, Bert Kreischer. I'm just kidding, he's not funny. Talking about groups who should have been bigger but weren't. The most well-known of the 3 bands he singled out was Liquid Jesus. They stood out in LA for their experimental sound, fusing blues, jazz, metal, and psychedelic rock. Liquid Jesus were really ahead of their time and attracted a pretty devoted following, forming in 1988. The band's name was born out of a childhood story involving guitarist and songwriter Todd Rigioni. It was a 5th grade tale when he attended Seattle's St. Francis Catholic School. He came to school one day during show and tell with his aquarium, which housed a fish that he had named Jesus. His teacher, of course, wasn't impressed, and his father, an old-school Italian, was embarrassed by his son's antics. The fish managed to live another 11 years, even surviving a trip down to Los Angeles on the front seat of a 1969 Ford Torino. That fish became a legend among Rigioni's friends, and when he formed a new band, they immortalized that fish, calling themselves Liquid Jesus. By the early 90s, the group was getting a lot of buzz around Los Angeles. Their music was eclectic and ambitious, with tracks that twisted and turned through different genres. They drew frequent comparisons to another LA act, Jane's Addiction, and it made sense given that their career trajectories seemed quite similar early on. They were signed to the same label, XXX Records, with their first release being a live album, which was issued in 1990. If you guys remember, Jane's Addiction's first release was also a live record, albeit it came out 3 years sooner. Like Jane's Addiction, the members of Liquid Jesus were also influenced by an eclectic roster of musical tastes, including punk, metal, and classic rock. Friend and pianist Bruce Hornsby even ended up sitting in on a few numbers on their debut record. One industry observer wrote in 1991, "Liquid Jesus are in essence a groovy rock and roll outfit with a grand lyrical bent, some breathtaking arrangements, and a selection of garish-looking shirts that suggest that maybe they're trying too hard. Individualism isn't as easy in a city that equates uniformity with success." Perhaps that last statement reveals why the band wasn't bigger. Liquid Jesus issued their major label debut, Pour the Sky, in 1991, and their follow-up, Mirrors for the Blind, shortly after. They did get some exposure on MTV, even appearing on Headbangers Ball. The group underwent some lineup changes a few years later in 1993, with Rigioni telling the Record Journal that some of his former bandmates just simply lost interest in the group. One of the most notable moments, though, from the group's career was covering Sly and the Family Stone's Stand for the Pump Up the Volume soundtrack, a cult classic film that introduced their sound to a wider audience. Despite their creativity and major label support, Liquid Jesus never broke into the mainstream. The early 90s were a time of rapid change in the music industry, with grunge and alternative rock dominating the charts. Liquid Jesus' unique style may have been too eclectic for mass appeal, and Rigioni, according to former Liquid Jesus drummer Kelly Scott, passed away in 2024. The second band that the Tool frontman discussed was Dumpster. These guys were also compared to Jane's Addiction and were known in LA as the best band that never happened. Formed in the late 80s, the members all met in LA and were a staple of the city's underground scene. Dumpster was a punchy mix of alternative rock and punk with a DIY attitude that really set them apart from the more polished acts at the time. Dumpster built a loyal following, playing clubs, and their drummer Kelly Scott later famously played in the group Failure. Great band, by the way, guys. I recommend you check them out if you haven't. But perhaps no opportunity was bigger for Dumpster than when they opened for Guns N' Roses in the spring of 1991, before the band issued their epic Use Your Illusion records. The drummer also played in Liquid Jesus, and here's my interview with Kelly Scott from a few years back where he discussed the history of Dumpster and their demise.
Because you were in a band called Dumpster. Could you tell us about like the beginnings of that band and how that band formed?
So back to the other band, the band was called Plastic Cadillac that I was playing in when I originally moved here. And when we were playing around, we met another band who just happened to live in the same building as a few of us called Liquid Jesus. And those guys asked me to play with them. So I wound up playing in both bands for a second until the band I moved here gave me an ultimatum, and I didn't enjoy being given an ultimatum. I felt that, I moved here to play music and I should be able to play with whoever, whenever I want. So when I was leaving that band, got in this band Liquid Jesus, and we put out a couple records like on MCA and Triple X Records. And while I was doing that, I met the Dumpster guys. And the situation in Liquid Jesus was kind of weird, where there was one guy in the band who was sort of the leader and became more or less the rule maker.
Yeah.
And again, like the previous band, he started making rules that I didn't agree with. So Dumpster was around, and they were getting rid of their drummer, and we were all friends. So I basically left one band and joined the other band the same day.
Wow.
And then instantly, became enemies with the previous band. Like, we would get in fights at parties, and it was.
You joined Dumpster. Like, you guys were, I know from what I've read, one of the you guys were like an up and coming band in LA. Like, were you guys getting a lot of record label attention?
We Dumpster was kind of kind of a sad story. I mean, it was that you've heard it a million times, where there's that band that everybody loves, and they have this great following, and they make really cool music, and all the record labels want to sign them, and there was definitely all of that. But on the inside, there was the main guy had a pretty bad drug problem.
Yeah.
To a degree that I don't think any of us really knew. But toward the end, definitely after the opening for Guns N' Roses stuff, he would take on meetings with record companies by himself and not let anyone know, and would just do really bizarre, unpredictable things like, we'd love to sign with you, but we've each got to have $1 million. And he was clearly high. If you've ever been around a high person, and certainly these record people he was meeting with knew what high looked like. It just kind of, it ended as quickly as it began.
Oh,
I was actually only in the band for, I think it rose and fizzled out within about 1.5 years, maybe 2 years.
The final band that Maynard talked about was called Dead, White, and Blue. They were part of the city's thriving alternative scene in the early 90s. They blended gritty alt-rock and post-punk. And Dead, White, and Blue only released one album called Heads in 1992. They also issued a few singles, including Play It Safe, Something to Do, and Ego, which showcased their knack for catchy hooks and emotionally charged lyrics. For a brief moment, it seemed like they might be the next big thing. The group, though, never managed to break out of the LA club circuit, and they struggled to secure a major label deal. Eventually, because of the changing scene, the members moved on to other projects. Maynard remembered Dead, White, and Blue as one of those bands with real potential, adding, "You see so many bands in Hollywood get caught up into the hype, lose focus, and fall apart before they ever get a real shot." For Maynard, Dead, White, and Blue were a classic example of how industry pressures can even derail the most promising acts. All these three bands I discussed in today's video shared the same traits. They couldn't quite make the leap from local heroes to national stars, and the pressures of the scene, the lack of label support, and the ever-shifting tastes of the 90s music world all played a part. So what can we learn from the stories of today's bands? Well, according to Maynard, the music industry is full of, and I quote, should-have-beens, talented bands who get lost in the noise, the hype, and the pressure. His advice? Basically ignore the outside voices, focus on your craft, and never lose sight of why you started making music in the first place. That brings us to the end of today's video, guys. Thanks for watching, and as always, if you have suggestions for future topics, let me know in the comment section below, and we'll see you again in Rock and Roll True Stories. Take care.